Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
I did that. That's my fault.
It's okay. The table broke the fall.
Cultural apologetics. What is it, you may ask? Well, that's the question we're going to be asking today to our special guest, Paul Gould. This is Brian Auten, and this is the Apologetics 315 podcast, and I'm here with Chad Gross, as always. How you doing today, Chad?
I am well. I am back. I am rested. My family and I spent the week at Ocean City, New Jersey, riding the waves and eating good food and enjoying the boardwalk and shopping. Also working through some of the material that we'll be talking about with Paul Gould and some of the other people. We actually have 3 interviews lined up this weekend, but you're only going to hear one right now because that would be ultra confusing.
You know, we've talked to a few different people, and cultural apologetics has been a bit of a topic. I'm thinking Lenny Esposito.
Lenny.
We spoke to David Baggett. He was talking about apologetics. Of course, HBU's program really revolves around this idea of cultural apologetics. We've been reading through Cultural Apologetics, Renewing the Christian Voice, Conscience, and Imagination in a Disenchanted World by Paul Gould. And so he'll be with us today. Let's talk a little bit about Paul Gould. He's an associate professor of philosophy of religion and the director of the MA in philosophy of religion at Palm Beach Atlantic University. He's also founder and president of the Two Tasks Institute and a past visiting fellow at the Henry Center for Theological Understanding at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's got a master's in philosophy of religion and ethics from Talbot School of Theology and a PhD in philosophy from Purdue University. You can find more information and resources for Paul Gould at his website, paul-gould.com. So that's paul-gould.com. So when it comes to cultural apologetics, for me, I'll just tell you where I'm at with it. I understand the concept. I just don't know what that means for me practically, how to put that into practice. You know, part of me, well, what am I supposed to do? Just go watch a bunch of movies and draw a bunch of parallels? Or am I supposed to paint something and have a hidden meaning? You know, right. I'm sure that's not the answer, but I'm sure the answer has something to do with making Christianity more attractive and building bridges to the gospel using cultural things, artifacts and culture and things like that. So I'm no expert, and that's why we have the expert today. Where are you at with the cultural apologetics there, Chad?
I'm in a similar place. I definitely agree that I like Paul's take when he says in the book that he talks about how the job of the apologist is to make the Christian faith both plausible and desirable. And I think I have some ideas of how to make it desirable. But I'm interested to hear what he's actually going to say in that regard. But I also wonder, it seems to me, and I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this as well, and I want to get his, is that there are a lot of people that are heavy on making Christianity plausible, but sometimes light on making it desirable. In other words, the way that they present it, they may have some good arguments, but the way they present it isn't necessarily winsome and attractive. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if that is his impression as well, that there are a lot of people that kind of major on making it plausible, but they minor on making it desirable. And maybe how can we as a Christian community work together to make it more of both?
Yeah. So the book is commended. He's like the go-to guy for cultural apologetics, or at least one of the top ones. So we're looking forward to the interview today.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Well, Paul Gould, thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be with you and Chad.
Well, for those who may not be familiar with you, can you tell us a bit about your background and your work, and maybe how you got interested in apologetics, philosophy of religion?
Yeah, sure. I grew up, right out of college, my first job I was a CPA in accounting. And so that's some people, when I share that with people, it's sort of surprising. You know, the next question is, how did you go from being an accountant to a philosopher? And that is a fun tale. I won't bore you with the whole thing. But so became a Christian in college, was confronted with the claims of Christ, And that, of course, changed the direction of my life. I was, as an undergrad student, I was majoring in accounting, and so I had a heart to sort of reach people for Christ in the business world. But I also realized pretty early on, though, working in the business world, that since God had sort of got a hold of my life, and then my wife, we got married shortly after college, my wife's life as well in college, we had a huge heart for college students. And so eventually we made our way back onto the college campus and became campus ministers. And that's where the sort of journey began toward philosophy. I noticed that in my evangelism, I always veered toward the intellectuals, or at least those who thought they were intellectuals. And I love to have conversations about Jesus in the context of ideas. And there's something about that just sort of awoke something within me that was new and interesting. And it was the form of questions like, what is the truth about this? And how do you defend, the existence of God and things like that? So all that to say, eventually it led to me wanting to get some formal education in philosophy, apologetics, theology, and things like that. So made my way eventually to Talbot School of Theology, loved philosophy so much, went and did a PhD, loved doing a PhD so much at Purdue University. And what I learned there, one of the joys of doing a PhD in philosophy is that you get to teach undergrads as a graduate student. And there is where I really learned, like, oh, teaching, this is where my heart sinks. Like I belong in the classroom, and just really realized that was sort of the thing that God had made me for. And so, from there, working actually during that whole time, still working with campus ministry, but really my heart began to move towards wanting to do academics and writing and speaking more directly and teaching. So eventually ended up teaching at a seminary in Texas for about 6 years. And then the last year, this is our second year here in Florida, now giving leadership to this philosophy of religion program at Palm Beach Atlantic University. So there's a thumbnail of the last couple decades.
We're excited to have you with us. And we're talking about cultural apologetics, and we've had a couple guests on, and we've sort of gone around the topic a bit. And we thought, oh, finally we can get Paul Gould on here. He's the man for cultural apologetics. And I think I know what it is. And I know that I don't really know what it is. I don't feel like I've got my head completely wrapped around it. So I'm, in your book, Cultural Apologetics, you define cultural apologetics as the work of establishing the Christian voice, conscience, and imagination within a culture so that Christianity is seen as true and satisfying. So for me, my first reaction is, hey, is this a little bit like Pascal's quote, make religion attractive, make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is? Can you kind of unpack that or give your response to my response?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I love Pascal, and I think he has his finger on the kinds of things that I'm interested in too. It's interesting, like in the background of that book, there was this question that was a question that drove me for the 16 years that I was a campus minister actually. And it was the question, how does the gospel get a fair hearing in culture? We're told by the secular intelligentsia that faith in God is irrational. In the early 2000s, there's this new movement called the New Atheist Movement, and they added to that chorus, not only is it irrational, but it's just immoral and unlovely. And all of that, it just always reminds me of this great book by Leslie Newbegin, who was a missionary sent to India, came back 40 years later to his sending country in Great Britain, realized that in the time he was away, his own country, as he put it, his sending country became post-Christian. And so he writes this book called Foolishness to the Greeks. And in that book, the very first page, he asks what I think is sort of like the crucial question for our day and age, whether we live in a post-Christian nation or however you want to describe it, was, how do we have a genuine missionary encounter between the gospel and the whole way of thinking, perceiving, and living that we call modern Western culture? And I just thought that was such a great question. It's not like the ultimate question. The ultimate question we want every person to ask and answer is, what do you make of Jesus Christ? But Newbegin understood that the gospel is never preached in a vacuum, that there's a cultural mindset, there's a cultural value system, there's a cultural imagination that actually shapes whether the gospel will be viewed as plausible or implausible, and then desirable or undesirable. And as it turns out, for a lot of people today, Christianity is neither looked at as desirable or, plausible. And so we've got this image problem, and that's sort of what drove this, the desire to write this book on cultural apologetics.
Yeah, I was actually that ties right into one of the questions I wanted to ask you. You do talk in the book about making the Christian faith both plausible and desirable. It seems to me, and I'm wondering, like, first of all, if you agree with this, and then I want to hear your thoughts. Would you agree that many today are kind of too focused on the first? In other words, they're heavy-handed on making it plausible, making good arguments and offering evidence, but then they kind of neglect the latter, making it desirable. Is that something you've noticed as well, or not so much?
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really good observation. And you're not doing this, but it's always important to note, like in this conversation, like any cultural apologetic worth its salt has to engage the reasonableness piece, right? So we're not giving up on truth. We're not giving up on that. And I know that, and you're not either, but it's just so good it's so important to state that. But like you suggested, I do think that there is, and this is sort of historically, it makes sense. I mean, if we're coming from the Enlightenment and we're told that for the last 300 years that there's no evidence for faith, or faith is blind, it's a leap in the dark, or whatever. So rightly so, we've been engaged on that question of the rationality of faith. But I'm just more and more convinced that, and it's just pretty obvious, that there's other objections to the faith. In fact, just this week at Palm Beach Atlantic University, we had an apologetics week with the undergrad students in chapel, and we had an open forum on Friday. And one of the questions that a student asked was, "What do you do if someone thinks that the Bible is historical, so it's true, but they hate the morality?" Right? And that was that question, like, is the Christian ethic like just unlovely, archaic, repressive, which has sort of become really important in culture. So yeah, the model that I know I call it cultural apologetics. I think this is just my view of what apologetics ought to be, is that we're just embodied human beings that of course we have minds, but we have so many other things. We're emotional, moral, relational, narrative creatures, imaginative creatures, all of that. And so let's use all of those resources to build a case for Jesus. So yeah, I think it's a both and that you're right. Right. We need to balance that ship. Yeah, good.
Yes. Yeah.
One of the things you unpack in your book is Paul on Mars Hill connecting what he saw in that culture, for instance, the altar, to the unknown God. And then he pointed out that what they were really looking for is the true God of creation. So, so many times I've read through that part in Acts and think, oh, well, Paul on Mars Hill, and then I'm realizing that, oh, okay, well, this is seeming to be the sort of foundational model for the work of cultural apologetics, where you're kind of finding out where the people are, what they are aspiring to connect with, and because they have this intrinsic hunger for something, you identify it and say, here, let me shift this hunger you have, this thirst that you have, this desire, and say, this is what you're really looking for. You just can't put a name on it. And so, that's sort of a little bit of an aha for me when I was reading the book, as seeing that's maybe the foundational model, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a number of places in writing the book where I felt like God just sort of dropped something in my lap. And one of those was actually just spending time in Acts 17, Paul at Mars Hill, and just realizing like the strategy, identify a starting point. Well, first understand the culture you find yourselves in, but then identify the starting point and then sort of build a bridge from that to Jesus and the gospel, and do it in a brilliant way, quoting their philosophers and their storytellers, effortlessly at the same time. And yeah, that's exactly the model that is unpacked in this book. It's modeled after that because, there's only two places in Acts where Paul engages a culture unlike his own. Acts chapter 14, when he engages the God-fearing Greeks in Lystra and Derbe, and then in Acts chapter 17. And in both of those instances, you see Paul doing the similar kind of move where he identifies these starting points and then builds a bridge from their world to the more familiar world of the Judeo-Christian sort of worldview. And he does it brilliantly. So yeah, that is definitely one of the inspirations in the model behind the whole book.
And following up on coming back to Pascal, he's one of my favorites. I just love the Pensée and everything in there. I just wish I could have met this guy and been his buddy. One of the things I noticed in there is that he's making all these cultural observations that men can't sit alone in a room, and this is the cause of all their problems, or they fear death and they can't stand the idea, and so they put something in front of them to distract them, or they're on their way to the end of a precipice, about to fall off, and they just won't look ahead because, and so he's observing culture, and he's basically saying, hey, everybody is trying to distract themselves from the inevitable. They don't want to think about death. They think they know God's real, and they just don't want it to be true, that sort of a thing. And then it seems to me like he was on the track for making a cultural apologetic, because he had all these arguments, all these cultural observations, and then he had various arguments, but he never had a chance to put it together. But yeah, now it helps me to, what you're saying there helps me to sort of connect with, okay, where are people at, and what are they really looking for? And how can I connect them that way, instead of just having a bunch of arguments at hand for when they ask me some things about cosmology, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's so one of the other sort of aha moments in relation to what you're saying about Pascal. And Pascal is super helpful. I think there's certain guides that help us. He, Lewis, Tolkien, others, that have sort of the beat on the human heart. The whole human person, I think, are very helpful. But actually, there's this book by Peter Kraft, who's a philosopher, who wrote this little book called Back to Virtue. And in there, he had this little chart. Remember reading this, where he talks about how God has given 3 prophets of the human soul. You'll see this. It's in my book, too, so it'll be familiar to you. But, God's given us a mind, a reason. And reason is on a quest for the object of its longing, which is truth. And then God has given us a conscience, and our conscience is on a quest for the object of its longing, which is goodness. And then, of course, he's given us the imagination, on a quest for the object of the imagination's longing, which is beauty. And then, you put on your theology cap and you say, well, what is the source of goodness, truth, and beauty? And the answer is Christ. And so it's like there's this, every human heart has these deep longings of the heart for goodness, truth, and beauty. And we're on these quests to discover the source of that. And of course, this is where I love Augustine too, as another thinker that I think is super helpful here. But in book 3 of the Confessions, he says of God, he says, you are the beauty of all beautiful things, and then the good of all good things. And I would just add the truth in which all true things point. And so our job as apologists, as cultural apologetics, is just sort of to awaken these deep-seated longings, like you said earlier, that we already have embedded within the human heart, and then just set people on that journey, help them as guides, and to show them that the source of these deep longings of the human heart, not just goodness, truth, and beauty, there's a whole host of them: love, justice, meaning, happiness, and of course, most fundamentally, for God Himself, that we can use in our apologetic, more than just the one plank of reason. That was back to Chad's question. We have that plank, and it's a well-walked plank, but there's all these other planks: the plank of the conscience and the plank of the imagination, that are totally underutilized. And Pascal was someone who I think is leading us to think more broadly about those things too.
Well, we're talking a bit about what cultural apologetics is, and that's really helping. And I just wonder, what is cultural apologetics not? Because sometimes in my mind I'm thinking it's just like, oh, let's watch movies and draw parallels, or paint something and look, it's a Christian painting, or so. So obviously that's the shallow, sort of poor representation of cultural apologetics. But could you tell us a little bit, like maybe some misconceptions people have when they hear that? Is it, maybe, for instance, like, oh, well, we're just going to engage with what's hot in culture right now, or whatever?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. I'll have to think more on that. No one's quite, usually they ask, what is it? But what is it not? I mean, it's certainly not. And I interacted, William Lane Craig, who we all know and revere or whatever, in his book, Reasonable Faith, in 2008, he equated, cultural apologetics to basically Francis Schaeffer type cultural analysis and critique. Mm-hmm. And he was pretty harsh on that. Hey, cultural apologetics is not interested in epistemic justification. It's not interested in truth. It's just interested in criticizing or critiquing the culture. Understandable, because in 2008, if you would Google the word, what is cultural apologetics, you wouldn't really find anything. And in fact, when I started teaching, even as you began, Brian, this podcast, you said, I've got a sense of what cultural apologetics is. I think we have the sense that it sounds like something we ought to be engaged in, but we don't really know what it is. And so it's interesting, when I started teaching at a seminary in Texas, and we were asked to develop an MA in apologetics, and I'm like, hey, let's have a class in cultural apologetics, right? It sounds pretty important, like something we ought to do. So of course I was assigned that class. And so when I started to teach that class, I did what any educator would do. I went to Google and I Googled, what is cultural apologetics, and there was nothing there. And so what I did that first year is I just grabbed 7 books that I was interested in on gospel, culture, and apologetics, and we read them and kind of used that as a little seminar. Next year, I swapped out those 7 books and we did another 7. Third year, did the same thing. And finally, it was probably that third year that I arrived at the definition that you read earlier in terms of a positive account. But yeah, so I think what it is taking a more robust view of what it means to be human. And of course, as humans, we're always in culture, we're making culture, and we're shaped by culture. And so, of course, we want to have apologetic that addresses all of that. So I think it's more holistic. So anything that tries to reduce it to so to get to your question, anything that tries to reduce it to I don't know, going to a book club, which is a good thing, or, that's not the sum total of it, or analyzing a movie, that's part of it, but that's not, I'm thinking of a holistic, what does it mean to be human, in culture? And one last thing that I found helpful is actually Andy Crouch, his book, Culture Making. He's got 4 different postures that he argues Christians ought not to take toward culture. And I would think you could probably take these postures as 4 different ways you ought not to think of cultural apologetics. And those 4 ways that he catalogs are this idea that we're merely consumers of culture, that we're merely critiquers of culture, that we're merely copiers of culture, and that we're merely critiquing. And he says, no, what God has called us most fundamentally to do is to be creators of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and then cultivators of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so I think that model, those give you an idea of what it's not and also what it is. We're creating and cultivating the good, the true, and the beautiful by pointing people to Jesus and the gospel as, the thing that we all long for most deeply. Good question, though.
Yeah. So I was wondering, it seems to me that, and I'm wondering if you agree with this, and if you want to expound on it any, do you think cultural apologetics is the most effective way to address some of the more volatile social issues? For example, I'm thinking of an issue like homosexuality. Instead of just offering an argument as to why homosexuality is wrong or a sin, we also couple that with demonstrating the beauty of God's design of marriage. So it's a both and. Or something like abortion, something like that. Do you think cultural apologetics is the best approach to those more volatile issues?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I do. For the reasons that you articulated, I think that I've learned, and I think what we see in culture is really an inability on certain topics, most of them social issues, to have reasonable, charitable discussions on things nowadays.
Amen.
And so, and even in the book, I talk about, there's this idea of sacred cores that people hold and that we've got to be aware of when we think about engaging. And so, yeah, I think it's much more helpful. Even pick an issue, pick homosexuality. I've realized, even teaching philosophy back at Purdue, I tried to approach it what is the moral status of the homosexual act? And of course, there is an answer to that question, but that wasn't the best way to teach it, I realized, in that class, because it shut people down. And so I've shifted in these discussions when people ask questions like, what do you think of X? Is it morally right or morally wrong for any cultural issue? Is just to sort of back up and sort of reframe it as a gospel issue and engage it through our longings and our desires. What's really in play here? Is it about love? Is it about identity? Is it about what does it mean to be human? And let's back it up that way. And that takes more. So this is one of the challenges. Is that means that we need to be informed about theology, and we need to be informed about culture, and then we need to learn to make connections between the two and to do them in an imaginative and reasonable way, in conjunction in both. And that takes a lot more work, and it's a lot more difficult, I think. But that's one way that we love our neighbor. So.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that interacting with your work, and even just in our discussion today, that I'm kind of realizing even on my end, the kind of the motivation behind the attitude of my questions is that I think I might be one of those ones that's a little, I need to be more balanced. And so I really appreciate, you through your work encouraging me to think about that.
Yeah, and just so you know, I mean, I'm a philosopher. I love propositions. I love arguments. It's
sure.
I traffic in them all day, but I've just realized that we can't reduce and you know, you're not either, but we can't reduce humans to merely these sort of thinking machines. We've got all these other things going on. And so it's just a good reminder, I think, because I've learned the hard way too. You know, it's just a good reminder that we're so much more.
Yeah, funny story I've told people before, and I'll just be brief, is that when I first became a Christian when I was 25, much of it was through arguments for the New Testament and the resurrection. And so I had in my mind, I didn't grow up really in a extremely religious home or anything. So I had in my mind that it was almost like a calculator. You know, you put in evidence and it equals people becoming a Christian, you know, and so I realized that, wow, there's a lot more to this than that, you know. So, yeah, I get what you're saying.
One thing that came up in a past interview was how culture has shifted from maybe being on a quest for truth, and like truth is the pinnacle, and then later it's like, no, it's kind of shifting to people are on a quest for happiness, and so we need to turn them back to truth. Now what you're saying, sort of, I don't disagree with that. I still hold to that, but we do need to focus on truth. But now I'm kind of hesitating, thinking, well, you know what, maybe what we need to do is say, okay, your true happiness, okay, you want happiness, well, here's how you're trying to find it. What has God actually designed for you to fulfill this longing? Because the phrase that keeps coming to my mind as you're talking, you're not necessarily saying it, is the deepest longings of our heart. And I guess what I think about is this idea that whenever someone is sinning, they actually want to get something. They want something. They're desiring something. They're just going outside of God's design to get it. Whether it's rebelling against God or just not knowing or ignorance or whatever. But so I'm thinking about, well, looking at culture and saying, okay, Instagram, what does that tell us? Well, maybe people want to find identity or recognition or affirmation. What are these longings that they're trying to fulfill through these outlets? I'm just picking something off, low-hanging fruit there, but you name it. You know, maybe someone who's totally into their work is trying to find identity or purpose or meaning. And maybe that's the touch point that we can start with is like, you know, your true meaning is found here. This is why all of these things are just feel like a hamster wheel striving that never fulfills you. Am I on the right track with that sort of thought in your opinion?
Yeah. I mean, I think of like, the Eleanor Stump has actually really been helpful in her book, Wandering in Darkness. She talks a lot about desires and the fact that God actually cares about our longings, of the deep longings of our heart for flourishing, right? And so like, you know, she says, think about the set of all your longings, the human desires that all of us have, as kind of an inverted triangle. If you could organize them into an inverted triangle, like at the top of that triangle, you'd have all our surface desires. You know, like I'm hungry for a hamburger right now, so that's a surface desire. But, you know, as you kind of go down, you have your deeper desires. And then as you get toward the bottom, you have your deep desires and then your deepest desire, right? Like right above. So the deepest desire would be, as Augustine puts it, you know, our hearts are restless until they find rest in God. So like our deepest longing of the human heart is to know God, whether we know it or not. That's how God has made us. And as it turns out, our deepest subjective desire actually is man's highest good, right? That's what we've been created for. So there's a kind of nice symmetry there. But right above that deepest desire on that, the sort of the apex of that triangle, are these deep longings. And right there, I would put goodness, truth, and beauty, the human longing that all of us have for goodness, truth, and beauty, love, justice, happiness, meaning, purpose. And this is what's like so brilliant with like C.S. Lewis and the argument from desire. You know, sometimes like in chapter 10 of Mere Christianity, the chapter on hope, in Mere Christianity, he talks about the deepest longing of the human heart. He calls it the longing for transcendence, but it's just the longing for God. But at other times, he'll give the same argument for desire, but he'll do it right above that deepest longing. Like, for example, in his essay on the weight of glory, he goes after beauty, which is right above that. You know, and argue for what is the thing that we long for in beautiful things, right? We long for something through it. And so he's taking us on this journey through our longings that finds it at its deepest source, Christ. And so, yeah, I've kind of recast the way that I think of, and even in the model inspired on Paul's example at Mars Hill, the starting points that I think we can all use are these deep longings of the human heart. And of course, one of those is for truth, right? So we care about that, but there's all these other deep longings, and we can use those and construct arguments. So yeah, I found that to be a helpful reframing, where you ask questions: what is it that you long for? And what is it that you long for most deeply? And then actually like holding that question, not just right now, not just for lunch, but like in life, as we press that, you get to those deep longings. And then the proposal is, and one way to define cultural apologetics is just showing that Christianity is true to the way the world is. That's the reasonable part. But it's also true to the way the world ought to be, right? That it satisfies all the deep longings of the human heart. And what an amazing story, the Christian story that satisfies both, true and satisfying, right? I mean, of all the competing stories, none, has that mantle of true and satisfying. That's why we're Christian, right?
One of the insights that you share in the book there, I think you take an illustration that C.S. Lewis used, looking along the beam, where he talks about looking at a ray of light coming, or a beam of light coming down through like a shed or something, and you can look at the light and you can see that, but then that's one perspective, but then you can look up the beam to the source of the light. So can you kind of unpack that little illustration better than me? Because for me, it was really helpful to say, to sort of transition my thought on this idea of cultural apologetics.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, that's a great metaphor. Yeah. So the essay, Meditations in a Tool Shed, and you can find this essay in God in the Dock by C.S. Lewis, collection of essays. And then in there, like you articulated just fine, he's looking at he's in a tool shed and he sees this beam of light, and he can look at it, and of course he can look along it. And if he looks along it, he sees out through the window or through the crack in the door, as he puts it, 93 or 96 million miles away, there's the sun. And that's actually a great metaphor for how I'm thinking of, one of the ways that I'm thinking of cultural apologetics is that we can look at certain phenomena like reason, truth, goodness, beauty, anything, and we can make an argument from that phenomena to God, right? And so in the book, I look at reason, I look at morality, I look at beauty, or the imagination. But then you can also sort of look along this longing, this quest that we have for goodness, truth, and beauty. And that's an experiential journey, a kind of quest. And that's part of our story too. And so actually I wrote in the book, Cultural Apologetics, at the end of it, I argue sort of more hopefully, well, it's in chapter 3, I argue more hopefully that we can join with God and each other to re-enchant the world. And I give sort of 2 ways that we can do that by, number 1, seeing and delighting in Jesus the way, seeing and delighting in the world the way Jesus does. And then number 2, inviting others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And those are 2 book projects that I want to pick up after this. And I just finished one of those 2 books, the second one, helping others to see and delight in the world, inviting them to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And so I just wrote a book that's not a book about cultural apologetics, but actually a book of cultural apologetics. And so, trying to do it with ideas and image, reason and imagination. And I took the reader on a quest where we're looking at 11 features. We're looking at 11 features of the world, and then kind of exploring them and experientially exploring them, and also looking what kind of argument we can give from there to the kind of, the kind of framework I'm doing is, a journey to discover the true story of the world. So yeah, I think that, and maybe in this book that's coming out in a year, it's to the publisher now, maybe it'll be a good, we'll see if I actually hit the tool shed, metaphor well, looking at it, but also taking readers on a journey that, values what it means to be fully human and have emotions and reason and image and ideas and all that together.
Yeah, I think it's great to bring out that idea of truth, goodness, and beauty, too, because these are concepts that are taken not only seriously by like the layman, but also by even like an analytical philosopher, right? I mean, these are ideas that kind of reach across both sides of the aisle. I mean, while you were talking, I was reminded of a quote that I shared on my blog by Paul Draper, who I'm sure you're familiar with. He's a skeptical philosopher. He says, "Theism is supported by the fact that the universe contains an abundance of beauty. A beautiful universe, especially one containing beings that can appreciate that beauty, is clearly more likely on theism than on naturalism." And so it's powerful because not only is this an intellectually defensible argument, but it's also one that appeals to the human heart.
Yeah. And I actually interacted with Paul and with that quote in this book on the chapter on beauty, because he's right. Like, he just says,
wow.
hey, but then when you add evil in there, it's outweighed, right? But even Paul sees that, just strictly speaking, there are things that awaken and evoke the transcendent, which is actually one of the features of beauty. It's evocative of the transcendent. And even I think Paul can see that. So yeah, that's great. I love that quote.
Yeah. And I like Draper's bean argument that I'm sure you're familiar with. It's just I think more beans fall in the theism jar than the naturalism jar, but he's a fun thinker to interact with, though.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I did my PhD at Purdue and Paul was there, and he was towards the tail end, but he joined he was around when I was defending my dissertation. So I've had some conversations with him about this. And I actually, in conversing with him, I was shocked. He knew evangelical Christianity just as much as any of us, very familiar with it and very open to having discussions. I remember even after my dissertation defense, he came out to lunch with me and the other professors. And then my pastor was there, and my pastor and Paul had just a wonderful conversation about not only Paul's journey of faith, as an agnostic, but a book that they had both read that's very deeply spiritual. And so you just never know what God is doing in people's hearts and the kinds of things that are in the background, even with someone that's convinced by the evidence of, from evil that there can't be a God. There's hope, right?
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that.
Well, my question would be, I feel like I'm, my understanding of the concept of cultural apologetics is being expanded, and I appreciate that. And I can sort of imagine how that would affect, conversationally. Maybe I'm like, I've been doing some of this already. I just didn't really call it that. Being maybe person sensitive in my apologetic, I'm thinking about where's this person at and what appeals to them, what are their struggles, etc. But when it comes to engaging with the world around us, if you're sitting and if you're sitting at your desk in front of your class and you're like, okay, I'm going to send out these cultural apologists, what do you in your mind thinking they're going to do? I'm trying to think, what is the practical, rubber meets the road? What does that look like? Becoming painters or book writers, creators of culture. I mean, maybe that's really what we need. We need cultural, and you talk about it in the book about transforming culture in different ways. But how do you see that in your own mind?
That's great. So one of the other distinctions that we haven't talked about, you actually just sort of alluded to it right at the end there, is I distinguish between, I think I call it in the book, local versus global concerns in cultural apologetics. You could think of it as like upstream and downstream concerns that are all also part of this project. Like upstream or globally, we do care about culture shaping institutions. We want to understand what culture is, how it's formed, how it's shaped, how it changes, how it shapes us. That's actually part of cultural apologetics too. So a big feature of the book was I'm convinced by a sociologist named James Davidson Hunter, who wrote a book called To Change the World. I think that's a really important book for Christians that care about culture and how we go about the task of world changing, which is this language that Christians have latched onto for the last 30, 40 years. But he says we've been doing it all wrong. And I'm convinced that he's right. And the all wrong view that he argues is that we kind of have this view of culture and cultural change that's bottom up. And the idea is, change enough individual people and you'll change culture. But he says that's never how culture has changed historically and even today. It's always top down, right? It's from people that exist at the periphery. They can be at the periphery, but they exist in the culture shaping institutions of the world. And they're the ones that get to sort of exert what he calls symbolic power or capital, that changes culture. And so we've got, as Christians, I think we've got to learn to do a few things. Like I argue that number one, we've got to think of ministry in terms of 4 dimensions instead of 2. And this isn't my idea. This is my friend Greg Gansel, who's a philosopher at Biola. Greg talks about how, typically he's a campus minister. I'm a campus minister from Crew. And what we did every year was we get the campus map out. We look at all the points on that map. So that would be length and width, right? 2 dimensions, and say, we've got to get the gospel to every place on this map. And that's 2-dimensional ministry. And we're really good at that, or, we can be good at that as Christians. But Greg argues, and I'm convinced this is right, we've got to begin to think of ministry in 4 dimensions. So go back to the map metaphor. The third dimension would be depth, that at every point on the map, we've got to drill down into the ideational structure, the emotional response pattern structure, the imaginative structure of culture. And then the fourth dimension is time, that we've got to have a window that's broader than 1 year or 5 years, which is about all we do as Christians. We've got to be thinking generationally. And so with all of that, to say that the global aspect or the upstream aspect is we've got to understand how culture is formed and shaped. And so we need to be men and women that are being trained to lead and to serve in culture shaping institutions. And with respect to truth, the main culture shaping institution is the university. With respect to beauty, the main culture shaping institutions would be the arts, so Hollywood and the publishing houses and the museums. And then the culture shaping institutions with respect to goodness would be this, I call it the city, but it'd be things like politics, law, government, city planning, stuff like that. We've got to be there. So that's part of what we do when we train cultural apologetics, is train future leaders that are fully convinced that the gospel is true and satisfying, so that they can see the world and delight in it the way Jesus does and invite others to do the same. So that's at the global level. And then to your question, at the local level, we're just training. I would envision training people to be sensitive to what it means to be human, that learn to listen and, not just be, I call them gunslinging apologists that have all our arguments and guns. And, when we see an atheist, we whip them out and we unpack all our arguments, put our gun back in, blow the smoke away and walk away. That's not the best way to do apologetics, So anyway, all that to say, and I know I've been rambling. This degree at Palm Beach Atlantic University, this Master of Arts in Philosophy of Religion, is really turning the volume up on cultural apologetics. How do we have a public-facing ministry that's robust, that sees, that really believes that in Christ are hidden all treasures of wisdom and knowledge, but yet is training people to go to all aspects of culture with this kind of robust understanding of the gospel. So anyway, okay, that was a soapbox. So I'll stop.
No, that was super helpful. Definitely. I was wondering, who would you recommend, or who do you think has done some great work in the past, even if, maybe it wasn't called cultural apologetics, but essentially it was, who has done great work in the past in this area and who's doing some great work now, obviously, other than yourself?
Yeah.
No,
I mean, for sure, C.S. Lewis, he's the model, I think, in some ways. Very much. Great scholar in a culture shaping institution, knew how to speak to his peers, but he also knew how to have a public facing ministry and to speak not just in academic work where you basically try to survive the reader, but he understood public work where you try to inspire the reader and you try to engage the reader and, educate the reader. Those are two very different kinds of writing. And he does, as we all know, he did that quite well. So I think Lewis, Tolkien too, those, anyone like that who hails from our age, but really understood the enchanted world that came before. In terms of now, who's doing it? I mean, I'm super encouraged. There's a lot of people that are, I'm super encouraged about the lane related to art, beauty, and the imagination. There's a lot of people doing important work that's exploring the connection between art, beauty, imagination, and apologetics. I mean, I'm thinking Phil Talon at Houston Baptist University, their whole degree there in cultural apologetics. I'm thinking like Justin Brierley and his book on reimagining apologetics. I'm thinking of people like the Anselm Society, folks that are having a conference right now as we're speaking on bringing beauty back into the church. And so there's all this interesting work that's taking place, even like the Andrew Petersons of the world and the Rabbit Room and stuff like that. On the pastoral lane, I'm encouraged by, for example, like John Tyson, who's a pastor out of New York, who's really been sort of galvanized by the kinds of concepts unpacked in the Cultural Apologetics book and is thinking through what does this mean for the church? And others would be Gavin Ortland. Same thing. He's got a book coming out in October that's blending reason and imagination, but good philosophy, for people to understand. And so there's lots of encouraging things that are taking place. I'm kind of excited though, like, I don't know. I'm noticing people are more interested in this, and that's great. But I think the sky's the limit, in terms of exploring what this could look like.
Excellent.
What do you think? Is there an issue in the area of cultural apologetics that you believe is being neglected?
I think that one of the ways that I frame a worry in the book is in terms of barriers to the gospel. And then I kind of distinguish between internal and external barriers. Internal barriers are things that have to do with us as Christians, as the church. And then external barriers would be sort of new challenges to the faith that are coming from, outside, from culture or something like that. I'm actually more concerned by the internal barriers right now. That is the things concerning us. I think there's just a rampant anti-intellectualism that has infected the church, and social media doesn't help that. I mean, if you read the literature on literally how technology in our is addictive and shaping our brain and ceasing us, we cease to ask, open-ended questions. We cease to be charitable. So I don't think that we behave really well on social media, but that's actually secondary. That's a moral issue. So intellectually, I'm worried that we have got to begin to pick up the call to love God with our mind. Morally, we're just as fragmented as our non-believing neighbor. We're horrific on social media. And we're discipled more by CNN or Fox News. It doesn't matter which one than we are by Jesus and the gospel and the kingdom of God. So we're fragmented. And then I do think this in the book. The three internal barriers that I raised in the book, I'm still concerned about. The third one. So the first one, anti-intellectualism. Second one, fragmentation. Third one, this idea of an unbaptized imagination. That we don't even see the world the way Jesus does, and we don't even delight in it. That's an emotional category. We don't delight in it the way that Jesus does. I'm just more and more convinced if we don't see the world, it's a kind of idolatry. It's a kind of disenchantment. Theologians talk about it as a kind of perceptual idolatry, where we reduce the things of this world and the people in this world to commodities. And I worry that we as Christians still have an unbaptized imagination. We don't see the world as it is. And the phrase that I'm using is the universe is a sacramental universe. It's deeply mysterious. It's beautiful. It's enchanted. Everything points to and is a sign of the divine in some way. That's partly the second book that I just wrote, is helping to see some of those clues. So yeah, my words are more in-house.
Wow.
And that's probably where I would leave it. There's, of course, always challenges to the faith from without, but it's not like Christianity can't handle those. And most of those we've seen before. So, yeah. But even how, and last thing, even how like the norms in culture are changing so quickly, like with respect to gender, let's say, in the last 5 years, 3 years, something that was not normative has become completely normative in gender and how the culture views it. That could be concerning, right? And we can be alarmist about that. But what's more alarming is that Christians aren't prepared to realize that there's a grain to the universe, there's an order to the universe, and wisdom is living according to the order of the universe. Like, we're not even prepared to understand that because we can't imagine a world that's created in that way by a God who lovingly sustains and cares for us. And so we're not equipped to like, we can freak out about the culture, but part of that is our fault, because we haven't painted a picture of a beautiful and satisfying story, namely the gospel that meets and addresses all the deep human longings of the heart.
That's very challenging. Wow. Yeah, that gives me a lot to think about for sure. Thank you for that.
Sure.
And my last question is just, I hope kind of a fun one. It was just kind of interest. I was interested. Who do you enjoy reading in the area of philosophy of religion? Kind of both Christian and non-Christian. Who do you particularly find yourself returning to and challenged by?
Yeah. Okay. That is a fun question. I love reading at all, in general. I keep a book log. So I read about 50 books a year. And then each January I post my favorite books in 4 categories on my website. So, if people are interested, just go to paul-gould.com. That's really the only thing I'm blogging, these days is like that once a year blog on my favorite books. But I usually
I'm sorry to interrupt real quick, but I was actually on your blog today, and it was funny. You mentioned Andrew Peterson earlier, and I saw that you mentioned the Wingfeather Saga. My daughter is a huge fan of the Wingfeather Saga. So it was neat that you mentioned that. But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
And he would be an example, that book, that series of trying to do the kinds of things that Lewis did. And so in the categories, best philosophy, best apologetics, best fiction, best nonfiction. So I've read in all those categories. I think it's important as just human beings that we're conversant with our culture. So I regularly watch the New York Times bestsellers, and those are the books that I read in fiction, because the stories that captivate culture are the stories that captivate the human heart. We want to be conversant with those. So that's why it's hard. I always return to Lewis, though, to answer your question. And in terms of analytic philosophy, since I'm a metaphysician and a philosopher of religion, I was formed most formatively by J.P. Moreland in terms of my views of metaphysics. So I would return to him, and I'm building on his legacy, I guess. I just finished contributing to a book, one of these multi-view books on 4 views on Christian metaphysics. And the view I defended was called Christian Platonism, which is actually Lewis would be an example of this. And I'm trying to bring that back into the discussion, even though it was the dominant view really for the first 1500 years of the church. So yeah, but all the usuals, Alvin Plantinga, Nicholas Wolterstorff.
Usual sources.
Excellent. Thank you.
Sure.
Paul, it's been a great conversation. The time has flown, and we really appreciate your time. We want to point our listeners to your website, paul-gould.com. Anything else that you would want to point our listeners to before we wrap up?
Thanks. Thanks for having me, guys. I do one way that I can kind of creatively try to express more of these ideas. I do have another website called the twotasksinstitute.org. And on there, I have a podcast that you can access called the Udo Podcast. And so my co-host and I have done 5 seasons on topics related to cultural apologetics. So we've got one on art, beauty, and imagination. The season we just finished, season 5, is on the search for meaning in a disenchanted world. So we drop a season at a time once a year. I'm excited about season 6, but you'll just have to wait for that. But it'll probably be on C.S. Lewis's science fiction. That'll come out spring of 2022. But yeah, so that would be the place. But people can find me on the normal places online.
Super. We'll point people to that in the show notes. Thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.
In the time before AT&T fiber internet.
Shame! Shame! Shame!
What did you do, love?
I ran out of internet data.
And they're making you shame walk.
No, it's just how I feel. Shame! Shame!
In the time after AT&T fiber internet.
Nice to have unlimited internet data, right?
Right.
The dawn of a better internet era with AT&T fiber.
Limited availability in select areas. Check eligibility at att.com/getfiber. Restrictions apply.
The General Insurance presents Shower Ballads by Shaq.
And I'm gonna keep on loving you, 'cause it's the only thing I wanna do.
Turns out, everyone does sound better in the shower. And it turns out, The General is a quality insurance company that's been saving people money for nearly 60 years.
I don't wanna sleep, I just wanna keep on loving you.
For a great low rate and nearly 60 years of quality coverage, make the right call and go with The General.
Some restrictions apply.